It's a hectic evening at New York's JFK Airport. Storms are closing in, and controllers are scrambling to land as many aircraft as possible while they still can. Stuck in a holding pattern to the south of the airport is a Boeing 707 operated by Colombian flag carrier Avianca. Inside, its 149 passengers are anxious to get down. But as the minutes tick on, the plane begins to run dangerously low on fuel.
Avianca 052, you have enough fuel to make it to the airport? Avianca 052, New York.
What you're about to watch is not a story about fuel or weather or air traffic control. It's a story about people and how they react and don't react when pushed to the edge.
Avianca 052, radar contact lost.
This is the story of Avianca Flight 52. It was a warm and sunny afternoon in Medellin, Colombia. An Avianca Boeing 707 had just arrived in from Bogota, the nation's capital, for a stopover on its way to New York. It would be taking 149 passengers on what was expected to be a 4-hour and 40-minute flight, operating as Avianca Flight 52. Most of the passengers were Colombian, though there were also some Americans on board. Some of them were traveling to New York on business, while others were going on holidays, and some were returning home to the US after a stay in Colombia. Taking care of them were 6 cabin crew members. Up front in the cockpit was a crew of 3. Sitting in the left-hand seat was the flight's captain, Laureano Caviedes, aged 51. A former member of the Colombian Air Force Reserve, Caviedes had been with Avianca for over 27 years and had built up almost 17,000 flying hours, a huge amount of experience. Just over 1,500 of these hours were on the 707. He had a clean safety record, and no performance issues had been noted during his line checks and simulator checks. Sitting to his right was 27-year-old First Officer Mauricio Klotz. Klotz was relatively inexperienced, having about as many total flying hours as the captain had hours on the 707. He had joined Avianca 3 years previously, and had only been flying the 707 for the past month, logging just 64 hours on it in this time. His training records indicated a normal progression up to the 707. Behind the pilots was the third member of the crew, 45-year-old flight engineer Matias Moyano. He had been with Avianca for 23 years, amassing more than 10,000 total hours, over 3,000 of which were on the 707. Each of these men had flown to JFK many times before, and were well accustomed to dealing with the often snappy air traffic controllers on the way into New York. But what they were not accustomed to was flying without what would usually be the fourth member of the crew, the autopilot. Even in 1990, the 707 was an antiquated aircraft, having long since been phased out by most major airlines in favour of more technologically advanced, fuel-efficient jets. But Avianca still operated some of these aircraft, and many of them were not in the best condition. This particular aircraft was 22 years old. Its autopilot had broken down the previous day, and maintenance engineers had tried fixing it back at Bogota that morning, without any luck. This meant that the captain had to hand-fly the aircraft to Medellin. This hadn't been too taxing, given that this flight was just 1 hour long, but the nearly 5-hour flight to New York would be another story entirely. As the pilots set up the aircraft for departure, they took on extra fuel for the journey, bringing the total fuel on board to just over 36 metric tons, or 80,000 pounds. This was the maximum fuel it could carry to be able to take off safely at Medellin, and it was more than enough for the trip to New York. In aviation, fuel planning is not done in a haphazard way. There are strict regulations governing how much fuel planes must carry. Flights operating under instrument flight rules, which basically all commercial flights do, must have enough fuel at a minimum to taxi to the runway and take off, fly to their destination, conduct an approach, carry out a missed approach, climb to altitude, fly to an alternate airport, conduct an approach there, fly for an additional 45 minutes, and also carry at least enough fuel to hold for 30 minutes at 1,500 feet. Avianca Flight 52 easily met all of these requirements, with enough fuel to stay in the air for 6 hours and 8 minutes. At just before 3 o'clock local time, Flight 52 was ready to depart. The doors were closed, the tug was connected, and the plane was pushed back from the gate. the pilots started the 4 engines and began taxiing out to the runway. The engines on this particular aircraft were fitted with a hush kit, which was basically a silencer attached to the exhaust. By this point, engine technology had moved on enough that the 707's engines were not only less fuel efficient than the aircraft which had replaced it, but much noisier too. In order to be allowed to fly over much of the world's airspace, they had to be fitted with hush kits. Unfortunately for the airline, these kits made the plane heavier and created drag, which further increased fuel consumption on the already gas-guzzling aircraft. They also had one more side effect, which we'll see in a few moments. At just after 3 p.m, Captain Caviedes lined up at the runway at Medellin and set takeoff thrust. Within a few moments, the heavy plane was airborne and turning north towards the United States. It was daytime and the weather was clear. The captain had an easy time hand flying up to his initial cruising altitude of flight level 350, or about 35,000 feet. Once there, the cabin crew began the meal service and the passengers were shown a movie. The flight progressed more or less normally, right on schedule. In a few short hours, the passengers thought they would be in New York. But about 1,500 nautical miles to their north, conditions were not so clement. A low-pressure system had moved in from the Great Lakes, blanketing the eastern seaboard of the United States with low cloud, poor visibility, rain, and high winds. The pilots were well aware of this. They had received weather information for New York when they started their day back at Bogota, and conditions had been marginal. But, as always, they had an alternate airport to go to, in case conditions in New York were unsuitable to land. Flight 52's alternate was Boston, 180 nautical miles to the north of New York. The only problem was that Boston had not been chosen as the alternate because the weather was better there. Rather, it was simply the automatically generated alternate for flights from Columbia to New York. If the pilots had reviewed the forecasted weather for Boston before departure, they would have seen the conditions there made it unsuitable as an alternate airport. If this seems curiously incurious on the part of the pilots, then what is even more surprising is what they would do about this situation en route. 2.5 hours into the flight, at just before 5:30 that evening, Flight 52 entered Miami's airspace. The first officer made contact with controllers there and received clearance to climb to the final cruising altitude of flight level 370. The captain put the plane into a gentle climb. As the flight continued north, the flight engineer noted the fuel contents against the flight plan, ensuring that the plane was consuming fuel as planned. So far, all was well. But this was to be expected while the plane cruised serenely in the blue skies above the eastern seaboard. The real question was how much fuel they would use as they neared New York. Because bad weather meant one thing: delays. The pilots didn't know it, but an entirely different storm was now brewing in the northeastern United States. Much like fuel planning, the flow of traffic into major airports generally isn't something left to chance. In fact, it's very tightly controlled by central planning authorities. For the US, this job is done by the Central Flow Control Facility, or more plainly, Flow Control. Located in Washington, D.C., this organization regulates the flow of air traffic throughout the United States. One of their most important functions is to ensure that the number of planes coming into an airport does not exceed that airport's capacity. Early that morning, the Flow Control Day Shift Supervisor had a discussion with the New York Terminal Area Controller, or TRACON, about the amount of aircraft that could land at JFK per hour. This is known as the aircraft acceptance rate. The TRACON controller suggested that given the weather, 28 aircraft per hour would be about right. But the supervisor suggested a higher rate, 30 to 33 aircraft per hour. If they didn't reach these numbers, domestic flights could face up to 3-hour ground delays. Under pressure not to cause delays, the controller accepted this higher rate. But what the supervisor didn't know was that because of the direction the wind was coming from, only one runway at JFK could be used for landing, rather than the usual 2. What this meant was that the airport's capacity was in fact limited not to 28 arriving aircraft per hour, and certainly not to 33, but to just 23. So, while JFK should only have been accepting 23 flights an hour, it was now accepting almost 50% more than that. JFK is busy at the best of times, but as the weather closed in and flights made their way in from all across the world, this was a recipe for chaos. Taking into account the bad weather at their destination, it would have been prudent, or even just natural, for the pilots of Flight 52 to get up-to-date weather information for their arrival. After all, if the weather at JFK was so bad that they would need to divert, they would want to do this sooner rather than later. Luckily for them, Avianca had a contract with a dispatch facility at Miami International Airport, which could get the latest weather at any airport the pilots wished. All the pilots had to do was call them on their radio. But as Flight 52 zoomed north past Florida, the crew made no contact with this service. By this point, the weather information that the pilots were working with for New York and Boston was over 10 hours old. You don't need to be a meteorologist to know that 10-hour-old weather information is pretty much useless. But that didn't appear to matter to the flight crew, who continued headlong towards New York, which was becoming increasingly congested. And the weather was only getting worse. This strange sense of fatalism and passivity would pervade the cockpit of Flight 52 all the way to JFK. But they couldn't keep their heads in the sand forever, because shortly before 7 o'clock that evening, reality would begin to impose itself on the crew. Air traffic control instructed the crew to enter a holding pattern over Norfolk, Virginia. They were still over 250 nautical miles from New York at this point, and the fact that they were already being instructed to hold should have given the pilots some indication that JFK was becoming seriously congested. But still, they didn't contact the dispatch service for the latest weather or for information about delays at JFK. The crew appeared to be resigned to whatever situation met them in New York. At 5 minutes past 7, Flight 52 entered the hold at Norfolk. As the captain was flying the aircraft, the first officer handled the radios. But with this particular crew, it may have been the other way around. That is, that the captain may have been flying the aircraft because only the first officer could handle the radios. English is the official language of aviation around the world, and nowadays, every pilot must have a basic level of proficiency in it in order to get their license. But in 1990, only one pilot on board needs to have passed an English proficiency exam. So, as long as either the captain or first officer had passed this exam, the pairing was acceptable. This was the case with Avianca Flight 52, with only First Officer Klotz being proficient in English. All communications between the cockpit and air traffic control would go through him. Even though this arrangement was legal, it did put extra demands on the communication skills of the pilots. The captain was unable to simply listen in and understand what the first officer and air traffic control were saying to each other. So, his mental picture of what was going on would come entirely from the first officer. Nowadays, such issues are mitigated by the existence of a crew resource management, or CRM, training program, which trains pilots to work together to effectively manage their workload and to catch any developing issues before they snowball into an emergency. But CRM training was not yet the industry standard in 1990, and Avianca didn't have such a program. Whether or not a particular crew worked well together was entirely dependent on how those individual personalities got on. The conditions the pilots of Flight 52 would meet as they neared New York would put their ability to work effectively as a team under extreme pressure. After nearly 20 minutes in the holding pattern over Norfolk, Flight 52 was finally cleared towards its next waypoint, Botan. The captain rolled out of the turn, now heading roughly north, and after receiving ATC clearance, began descending to flight level 220. As the captain began the descent, the flight engineer noted that they had 17,000 pounds of fuel remaining, or about 7.7 metric tons. With this figure in hand, it would have been a good idea to estimate the distance and time remaining until they reached their destination, and calculated another figure known as the minimum approach fuel. This was the amount of fuel they would need on board when starting their first approach. If it looked like they wouldn't have this fuel, the captain would need to divert. But for some reason, the crew never made this calculation. They simply pressed on towards New York. Fatalism reigned supreme in the cockpit of Flight 52. In the cabin, the passengers were aware that the plane was being delayed, but as far as they were concerned, This was a mere inconvenience. They could not have known that minute by minute, the pilots were going down a path which would be harder and harder to get out of. Shortly after 7:30, air traffic control delivered more bad news. Flight 52 would now need to enter another holding pattern, this time over Botan, just off the coast of Atlantic City in New Jersey. At least they were closer to New York now, but with only 9 minutes left of their 28 minutes of holding fuel, they wouldn't have long until they had to decide whether they would need to divert. Now would have been a good time to put together a contingency plan. Very soon, they would need to either divert or commit to JFK. But the pilots never made such a plan. The controller responsible for Flight 52 was well aware that the flight would face further lengthy delays that evening, but he was under no obligation to pass this information on to the crew, so he didn't. This being the case, the crew were labouring under the misapprehension that they would be cleared towards JFK any minute now. Before long, Flight 52 was entering the hold at Botan and descending further to flight level 190. At this lower altitude, the thicker air caused the engines to burn fuel a lot faster. So, the closer the flight got to New York, the faster the clock began to tick. It wasn't long before the flight had burned right through all of its holding fuel. There was still plenty of fuel left, but none of it had been allocated for holding. Now, the crew needed to either make an approach into New York or divert. But they did neither, and instead began eating into their reserve fuel. It was now 20 minutes since the pilots had entered the second holding pattern, and finally, they were beginning to wonder whether they would be making it into JFK on this evening. They asked air traffic control about whether there were delays at Boston. The controller told them that Boston was open and accepting traffic. What he didn't tell them, because he hadn't reviewed the weather there, was that it was completely unsuitable to use as an alternate. The cloud ceiling was just 200 feet above the airport, the visibility was 1/8 of a statute mile, and there was fog and drizzle. Curiously, although not out of keeping with their behaviour so far in the flight, the pilots didn't check Boston's weather either. Then, the controller told them to contact the next controller en route, and said that they should expect as much as 30 extra minutes of holding. Surely now it was clear to the pilots that they would need to check the weather at Boston and make their way over there if it was looking good. They couldn't afford another 30 minutes in the hold. But not once to question or complain, the pilots simply switched radio frequencies. The new controller then directed them towards the third waypoint they would hold at on this evening, Cameron. Cameron was located just 39 nautical miles south of JFK, tantalizingly close, and yet a sense of claustrophobia now began to creep into the cockpit. They may have been closer to the airport now, but for every moment they delayed their decision to divert, their options got narrower and narrower. The airspace was chaotic. Controllers were stacking incoming flights into holding patterns, their voices strained as they handled the traffic. Some pilots were asking for approach estimates, others were inquiring about alternate airports. In the cockpit of Flight 52, the stress was mounting. Captain Caviedes had been hand-flying for over 5 hours. Exhausted and struggling with the English language radio chatter, he had to rely on his less experienced first officer to keep him informed. This was grueling, and it was only going to get worse. In aviation, as with many systems, failures don't just stack on top of each other in a linear way. Bad weather plus autopilot failure plus delays plus communication difficulties. Instead, these issues compound and multiply. Difficult weather makes manual flying harder. Manual flying makes dealing with delays more exhausting. Fatigue makes it harder to understand English radio chatter. Miscommunication adds confusion. The problems the pilots of Flight 52 faced were mutually reinforcing. They actually made each other worse, making the situation more unstable by the minute. The crew had been told to expect further clearance at 8:30, just 20 minutes from now. They were hoping that this clearance would take the form of an approach into JFK. But there was no reason it couldn't simply be another set of holding instructions. Given this, it would have made sense for the captain to simply draw a line in the sand, saying something along the lines of, "If we're not clear to Kennedy by 8:30, we divert." But the captain didn't do this. Nobody did. The controller was completely unaware that Flight 52 was beginning to run low on fuel. As the plane's fuel tanks got emptier and emptier, the range of the aircraft was getting smaller. If the pilots kept waiting, they wouldn't be able to make it to any alternates. Their only choice would be JFK, and conditions at JFK were getting worse by the minute. In fact, by this point, 1 in 5 aircraft making an approach into the airport had to go round. The controller cleared the flight down to 14,000 feet. Shortly after, they entered the hold at Cameron. Round and round they went in a racetrack pattern, the captain heaving the aircraft to the left every 2 minutes as the fuel gauges ticked lower and lower. At Kennedy Airport, the hectic scenes continued. But finally, after a nauseating wait, with just 3 minutes to go until 8:30, the pilots received their next clearance, and it was good news. They were now to exit the hold, descend to 12,000 feet, and to fly heading 230. This was southwest, away from the airport, but at least they were out of the holding pattern. A few minutes later, the flight was cleared to descend further, to 11,000 feet, and to turn left heading 040, back northeast, towards Kennedy. At long last, they would be making an approach. The controller told the pilots that the RVR, or runway visual range, at JFK was 2,400 meters, and he asked whether this visibility was good enough for them to make an approach. The first officer confirmed that it was. It wouldn't be easy, but the crew were now finally about to make an approach into JFK. But just minutes later, as the flight progressed northeast, the controller's voice came through the radio. Avianca 052 was to enter the hold again. Frustrated, but still unwilling to declare an emergency, the crew turned back around towards Cameron. By now, the captain was exhausted. He had been flying for hours with nothing but darkness out the windows and nothing to rely on but an array of small mechanical needles and dials. Around he went again, throttles in his right hand and control column in his left, keeping the plane at the speed and altitude air traffic control had requested of him. His eyes scanned the void outside, searching for other aircraft in the crowded airspace, which the controller had told him to look out for. The red lights of the cockpit, designed to protect the pilot's night vision, now bathed the cramped space in an eerie, hellish glow. The 707 had no indicator light to alert the pilots to a low fuel state, but the needles on the fuel gauges were hovering dangerously close to zero. Finally, not able to ignore the situation any longer, the first officer piped up. He asked the controller whether he had any estimates for when they might be leaving the hold.
Avianca 052, heavy, expect further clearance time 0205.
The response was not reassuring. Further clearance would come at 9:05 p.m. Even for this crew, 9:05 was pushing it. Sloshing around in the wing tanks was just 49 minutes of fuel. First Officer Klotz told the controller that they needed priority to land. This might seem like a significant step up in assertiveness compared to how he had been communicating with air traffic control previously. But a critical misunderstanding would now occur between the controller and Flight 52. The first officer, like many Avianca pilots, had been trained by instructors who followed Boeing guidance, and those instructors had used a bulletin from Boeing to describe how a crew should communicate a low fuel state to air traffic control. One part of this bulletin stated, "During any operation with a very low fuel quantity, priority handling from ATC should be requested." A lot hung on this one word, priority. As far as the first officer was concerned, he had just told the controller that the plane's fuel situation was urgent and that he needed to land immediately. But aviation has strict terminology for emergencies. Pilots in distress are trained to use specific words: mayday, pan-pan, or emergency. The word priority is not a recognized word for an emergency. As a result, the controller did not grasp the seriousness of the situation. Instead of clearing the flight to land immediately, he simply asked how much longer they could hold. Had the first officer said mayday or even pan-pan, the plane would have been given immediate clearance to carry out an approach. Instead, the misunderstanding would now only deepen. The first officer responded that they could hold for 5 more minutes. The controller asked for their alternate airport. The first officer replied that Boston was their alternate, but quickly added that they no longer had enough fuel to reach it. Unfortunately, just as he said this, another controller spoke to the one handling their flight. This crucial detail, that they could not reach Boston, was missed. Yet another opportunity to recognize the severity of the situation had slipped away. From the controller's perspective, the flight had 5 minutes to decide whether to continue holding or divert. But the reality, which only the pilots understood, was that there was no decision left to make. JFK was now their only option. Despite the miscommunication, the controllers did their best to accommodate the request for priority. They instructed the crew to reduce to a speed of 180 knots, descend to 7,000 feet, and proceed directly to a radio beacon near the airport. The pilots, understandably but mistakenly, assumed that they were now being handled as an emergency aircraft. With the winds favouring an approach to runway 22 left, flights arriving from the south, like Flight 52, had to take a longer, more indirect route to properly align with the runway. This added distance would prove critical. Barely 10 minutes after receiving this clearance towards Kennedy, the pilots were told to do a 360 in order to put more space between them and other aircraft. Strangely, but again, perhaps not surprisingly, the first officer accepted this without any protest. If the controller knew that Avianca 52 was in a fuel emergency state, as the pilots believed he did, then there is no way he would have told them to do another loop. And with the plane at a much lower altitude now than it had been earlier, the few minutes it spent in this loop would cost it more precious fuel. Their fuel had now gotten so low that the flight engineer was leafing through his manuals looking for a section on the special go-round procedure which is used when there is less than 1,000 pounds of fuel left in any of the plane's tanks. The controller cleared the pilots down to 5,000 feet, and Captain Caviedes continued his descent. Given the level of congestion at Kennedy, the Avianca flight was far from the only one experiencing fuel issues. Just ahead of them, an American Airlines flight announced to the controller that they were at a minimum fuel state.
Ticket 692, I want to advise you we're at minimum fuel. We're about 12 or 14 minutes from declaring an emergency.
Why the pilots of Avianca 52 didn't also declare that they were at a similar state is unknown. The captain, with his limited English, may not have understood this transmission from the American Airlines pilots, and First Officer Klotz, who would have understood the transmission, probably believed that he had already said something similar himself. The pilots had now completed their loop, and were back heading northeast towards the airport. The controller then handed them off to New York Approach Control, but not before providing them with some unwelcome news. The crew of a Boeing 727 had reported encountering wind shear while on their final approach to the runway. Wind shear is a sudden change in wind direction or speed over a short distance, and it's one of the most feared weather phenomena encountered by pilots. If you experience it, you must go around immediately or risk being thrown to the ground. This approach was already hard enough, but the now exhausted captain really could have done without the possibility of wind shear. He knew that given how little fuel they had, he may not have enough for a second approach. The pressure was now well and truly on. The first officer made contact with Kennedy Approach Control.
Approach Avianca 052, leveling 5,000. Avianca 052, heavy New York approach, good evening. Fly heading is 060. Big 060, Avianca 052, heavy.
Once contact was made, Flight Engineer Moyano began briefing the pilots on the special low-fuel go-round procedure. Crucially, if the crew had to go around, they would need to keep the nose relatively low and advance the power slowly. Any significant pitch up, and the remaining fuel could slosh away from the fuel pumps at the front of the tanks, possibly starving the engines of fuel and causing them to flame out. If the low fuel pressure lights illuminated, this would be their sign that the pumps were not drawing enough fuel. As this briefing was happening, the controller checked in with the American Airlines crew, who were minutes from declaring a fuel emergency.
American 692, how are we making out? We got enough fuel for the approach and landing, and that's it. Okay, understand.
The controller knew exactly what this flight situation was, as they had stated it clearly. By contrast, he really had little idea of Flight 52's situation. Although they were warned of low-level wind shear, the pilots didn't brief on what they would do if they encountered it while landing. much as it had been with their attitude towards the fuel, they figured that they would cross that bridge when they got to it. Once the flight engineer was finished with the briefing, the captain and first officer continued setting up the navigation radios to pick up the instrument landing system for the runway. Once lined up, they would use their instruments to follow these radio beams all the way down to the runway. Finally, the controller gave Flight 52 instructions to intercept the localizer for runway 22 left.
Avianca 052 Heavy, you're 15 miles from out of marker, maintain 2000 to establish a localizer. Clear RS 22 left.
At long last, it was happening. The captain, who'd been hand-flying for over 6 hours now, couldn't have been more pleased. The flight was well and truly on the home stretch. The captain asked for the flaps to be lowered to 14 degrees, helping the plane to fly at a slower speed as it prepared to land. Shortly after, the controller asked the flight to bring its speed back to 160 knots, about 300 kilometers per hour. The captain slowed down, and the first officer lowered the flaps further to 25 degrees. Anxious to know how much distance they had left to the runway, the captain asked the first officer how far the outer marker was, approximately the point where they would start their final descent down to land. The first officer told him that they were 10 nautical miles from the outer marker. The outer marker was 6 miles from the runway, so they had 16 miles until touchdown. The localizer needle came alive, and the captain turned to fly towards the runway. Shortly after, the approach controller handed the pilots off to JFK Tower.
Avianca 052 Heavy, contact Kennedy Tower 119.1, good day. 119.1,
If all went well, the next controller they would be talking to was the ground controller. And with just 18 minutes of fuel left, all really did have to go well. The pressure the captain was under to get it right the first time was immense. Behind him, the lives of 155 people depended on it. The captain slowed to the final approach speed of 140 knots. The plane was now very much configured for landing, except for one thing: the landing gear. The captain asked the first officer if he should lower them, but the first officer was wary. He warned him that if they lowered the landing gear and then had to go around, the extra drag the gear created would mean they would have to hold the nose higher in order to climb. And with their low fuel state, this was not the best idea. What's more, even if they didn't have to go around, the extra drag from the gear would increase their fuel burn, which they really couldn't afford right now. Their fuel indicators were teetering just above zero. These instruments were not precise enough to give an exact figure, but the pilots knew that at any moment, their engines could simply flame out. The controller asked the flight to speed up by 10 knots, up to 150 knots. There was confusion in the cockpit as the captain's stress level grew. He hadn't understood what the controller said and asked his colleagues to repeat it and to speak louder. Finally, the glide slope needle began moving. This would provide the pilots with vertical guidance down to the runway. When it was centered, the plane was on the glide slope. If it moved up, it meant that the plane was below it, and if it moved down, it meant that the plane was above it. Likewise for the localizer, providing the captain with lateral guidance. If it moved right or left of center, the captain would need to follow it to regain track. Normally, the captain would also have flight director bars appearing on this instrument, which would guide him towards the runway in a more intuitive way. But then, all he would have to do is point the plane where the flight director told him. But on this night, the flight director wasn't working. The captain would now have to rely on what is known as raw data in order to fly the approach. That is, he would have to fly it entirely with reference to the glide slope and localizer needles, which only told him where he was in relation to the ideal path, but not how to fly it. This isn't too hard on a calm day, but in windy conditions, it can get very challenging, requiring intense concentration. Once the plane was established on the glide slope, the captain called for the landing gear to be lowered. Then, he did something which was specifically forbidden for 707s whose engines were fitted with hush kits. He asked for the flaps to be lowered to 40 degrees. According to the aircraft's flight manual, when hush kits are installed, anything beyond 25 degrees of flaps is prohibited. That's because, as well as creating lift, flaps create a lot of drag. And what overcomes drag? Thrust. With their critically low fuel state, the last thing the pilots needed right now was to send more fuel to the engines. But nonetheless, that's exactly what they did. About 6 miles from touchdown, the pilots were cleared to land. The captain then called for the final stage of flaps, 50 degrees. This created a huge amount of drag, which the captain overcame by adding yet more thrust. The plane was now burning fuel at a prodigious rate. At this point, it was almost running on fumes. Normally, when following the glide slope, pilots try to fly at a constant rate of descent. Their rate of descent at any given moment is shown on this instrument here, the vertical speed indicator. The ideal rate of descent depends on the plane's ground speed. Naturally, the faster a plane is travelling over the ground, the faster it will need to descend in order to stay on the ideal path. A standard rate of descent for a jet like the 707 flying at normal approach speed is around 800 feet per minute. But the strong headwind which Flight 52 faced meant that the plane was travelling much more slowly over the ground. So, the captain needed to make his descent more shallow in order to stay on the ideal profile. But for some reason, the captain was descending as if he only had a light headwind, despite experiencing headwinds of up to 60 knots. What this meant was that he now started to drift below the glide slope. The first officer saw this and alerted the captain. The captain tried to correct it, but exhausted and under extreme stress, he struggled to maintain the glide slope for more than a few moments, drifting above and below it as he descended. The runway was still out of view, obscured by dark cloud. The pressure mounted as the altitude ticked down. Would the pilots see the runway and be able to land? It was crucial that the captain stayed exactly on the glide slope and localizer, so that when they did see the runway, they would be lined up correctly. Below glide slope, called Klotz, now for the 4th time. The plane was just 600 feet above the ground at this point. In response to this, the captain didn't just shallow the plane's descent to allow the glide slope to come back down to him. Rather, he put the plane into a climb. Within seconds, he had shot above the glide slope. But before he could even recognize this and correct for it, the strong headwinds the plane had been experiencing all along got weaker. With less air going over the plane's wings, the aircraft began to drop rapidly. "This is the wind shear," called the first officer. "Glide slope," he shouted, watching the plane sink back down below the glide slope. He warned the captain that they were descending way too fast and were now just 500 feet above the ground. Then 400, then 300. If the captain didn't do something fast, the plane would end up in a fireball on the ground. Caviedes slammed all 4 throttles forwards and hauled back on his control column. The ground proximity warning system blared, alerting the pilots that they were moments away from hitting the ground. The passengers screamed as they felt the plane drop. Incredibly, the captain managed to stop the descent just 200 feet above the ground. That's barely more than the length of the aircraft itself. But the runway, now just over a mile away, was nowhere to be seen. "Where's the runway? The runway, where is it?" shouted the captain. "I don't see it, I don't see it, I don't see it," Klotz replied. It was a horrifying prospect, but there really was no other option. The pilots would have to abandon their approach and go around to try again. The captain put the aircraft into a steep climb to safety, throwing the passengers back into their seats. "Give me the landing gear up," he shouted, and the first officer complied. Caviedes then told Klotz to ask the controller to bring them back in to land. But with barely 10 minutes of fuel remaining, this would be easier said than done. In fact, the crew simply didn't have enough fuel to go all the way back to the outer marker and then back in towards the runway. "Smooth with the nose, smooth with the nose, smooth with the nose," urged the flight engineer. If the captain overdid it on the climb, the fuel wouldn't be able to reach the pumps and the engines would quit. The passengers knew that something was wrong. Some prayed, while others got out of their seats, infuriated and scared, only to be forced back by the flight attendants.
Aviation 052 Heavy, watching, maintain 2000, turn left heading 180.
Frustrated, the captain told the first officer to pass on the message that they didn't have fuel. A heading of 180 south was absolutely not what they needed. But the first officer complied with the controller's instructions. The pilots then started retracting the flaps to 25 degrees as their speed increased. "Tell him we're in emergency," the captain ordered. This was the first time that the word emergency was used in the cockpit of Flight 52. The first officer simply had to explain the true severity of their situation to the controller. but all he could muster was,
180 running heading, and we'll try once again, we're running out of fuel. Okay.
running out of fuel could have meant anything as far as the controller was concerned. Most likely, it meant that the flight crew was now eating into its reserve fuel, giving it maybe 45 minutes or so. But Flight 52 had closer to 5 minutes left. The captain asked the first officer what the controller had said. After all, okay was surely not his response to the first officer's declaration of a fuel emergency. Maintain 2,000 feet, 180 on the heading. I already advised him that we're going to attempt again because now we can't. Tell him we're in an emergency. Did you tell him? Demanded the captain. Yes, sir. I already advised him. Whether Klotz didn't want to admit to the captain that he hadn't, or whether he thought that saying we are running out of fuel was equivalent to declaring a fuel emergency, didn't really matter now. The fact was that the controllers had no idea how severe the flight situation was. The tower controller then instructed them to turn left heading 150, southeast, before he handed them back to approach control.
Approach Avianca 052 Heavy, we just missed the approach and we're maintaining 2,000. Avianca 052 Heavy, New York, good evening, climb maintain 3,000.
Tell him we don't have fuel, the captain insisted. He wanted to make absolutely sure that this new controller was aware of their situation.
Climb maintain 3,000 and we're running out of fuel. Okay, fly heading at 080.
This still wasn't the emergency vectoring that the pilots needed, but they said nothing. The passengers were still terrified after the near crash on the first landing attempt, but they had no idea that the wind was now the least of their concerns. Wanting to get a sense of the crew's fuel state while still maintaining a good flow of traffic, the controller ran his plan by the pilots.
And Avianca 052 Heavy, I'm going to bring you about 15 miles northeast and then turn you back on for the approach. Is that fine with you and your fuel?
This was certainly not okay. The crew didn't have anything like enough fuel for such a lengthy approach path. First Officer Klotz simply responded,
I guess so, thank you very much.
This response gave the strong impression to the controller that while the fuel situation was bad, it was nowhere near a fuel emergency. What did he say? The captain asked. The guy is angry, replied Mariano. The controller was not angry, but the fact that the crew thought he was may give an insight into why they were so hesitant about alerting air traffic control to their low fuel situation. Whether this affected their decision-making or not, the captain should have told the first officer to request an immediate return to the runway. A 15-mile final clearly wasn't going to cut it. But he didn't say this. Avianca Flight 52 continued northeast, dutifully following the controller's instructions. We must follow the identified ILS, said the first officer. To die, replied the captain. He knew that they would probably run out of fuel before they got back to the airport. As the plane passed to the east of Kennedy Airport, the first officer finally asked the approach controller for a turn straight in towards the runway.
Can you give us a final now, Avianca 052 Heavy? Avianca 052, affirmative, sir, short left heading 040. 040, Avianca 052 Heavy.
This wasn't a turn in towards the runway. The pilots were too close to the airport for that, and they wouldn't have time to line up. So, the controller cleared them to fly northeast first, to give them enough space. The pilots were growing desperate now. They had used what was probably their only good attempt to land, and now they were stuck in their glowing red cockpit with nothing but darkness around them, burning fuel as they travelled away from the airport. Then, the controller told them to climb.
Avianca 52, climb maintain 3,000.
But the pilots knew that if they powered the engines up for a climb, that could use up whatever was left of their fuel.
Negative, sir. We're just running out of fuel. We're good. Okay, 3,000, that'll be good.
But Klotz accepted the instruction anyway. The pilots were growing hopeless. They started to feel as though they were doomed no matter what they did. In the back, the passengers had no idea quite how dire their situation was.
Okay, turn left heading 310, sir. 310, Avianca 052.
This was a step closer. A heading of 310 northwest would bring them towards the extended runway centerline. But this instruction was quickly followed up with an instruction to fly heading north instead.
And Avianca 52, fly heading at 360, please. Okay, we'll maintain 360 now.
Tell me, heading what? Asked the captain. 360 now, said Klotz. This was a much less direct path to the runway, but one the controller figured would be necessary in order to give the pilots enough distance to line up with the runway without overshooting it.
Okay, you're number 2 for the approach. I just have to give you enough room so you make it without having to come out again. Okay, we're number 2 and flying 360 now.
1 minute later, the controller told them to turn left towards the extended runway centerline.
Avianca 052 Heavy, turn left heading 330. 330 heading Avianca 052.
As the captain started turning left, the lights in the aircraft began flickering on and off. Almost immediately, the outboard engine on the right-hand side quit. Flame out on engine number 4, Moyano announced. The pilots were horrified. It was actually happening. Just 17 miles from the airport, they were now losing an engine due to fuel starvation. Seconds later, the other engine on the right-hand wing flamed out. Flame out on engine number 3, said the flight engineer. They could still make it to the airport on 2 engines, but was there enough fuel left to keep those engines running? The captain begged for the runway to come into view, but dark clouds enveloped the aircraft.
Avianca 052 just lost 2 engines and we need the priorities, please. Avianca 052, turn left heading 250, intercept the localizer. Roger.
The full gravity of the situation was now clear to the controller. The flight, which he figured was just low on fuel, had in fact been in a fuel emergency state, which the pilots had never announced. The captain began steering the plane to a heading of 250, desperate to make it to the runway. Select the ILS, he said, urging the first officer to give him the ILS display on his instruments. In the same wind shear conditions, he would now try to make a second approach on just 2 engines. He was hoping that he could make it to the runway before running out of fuel entirely.
Avianca 052 Heavy, you're 15 miles from out of marker, maintain 2000 till establish a localizer, clarify ILS 22 left. Roger, Avianca.
But just 10 seconds after this transmission, the remaining 2 engines flamed out. With that, there was a total electrical failure on board the aircraft. 6 hours and 25 minutes after takeoff, and still over 10 miles from JFK, Avianca Flight 52 had run out of fuel. In the pitch-black cabin, the passengers cried and prayed as the plane fell towards the ground. Without engines, the only external sound was the haunting whoosh of air rushing past the fuselage. The captain tried gliding the aircraft, controlling its descent as much as possible. But with nothing to see out his windows, there was no landing site he could aim for. He was flying completely blind. He had just 30 seconds until impact. And without landing lights, he wouldn't even see the ground coming.
Avianca 052, you have enough fuel to make it to the airport?
There was an ominous silence.
Avianca 052, New York.
The controller could see the plane on his primary radar descending much lower than it should have been at that distance from the airport. Moments later, the aircraft crashed into the community of Cove Neck in New York.
Avianca 052, radar contact lost.
Of the 158 people on board, 73 died, including all 3 of the cockpit crew and 5 of the 6 cabin crew. As a result of this accident, major air safety reforms were brought in, aimed at preventing something like this from ever happening again. Pilots are now required to explicitly declare a fuel emergency using Mayday when they need immediate priority, eliminating ambiguous language like low on fuel. Air traffic controllers must now proactively confirm distress signals and relay fuel critical status across sectors to ensure priority handling. Crew resource management training became mandatory following the incident, emphasizing assertive communication and decision-making, while fuel management training now includes strict thresholds for emergency declarations. Airlines around the world have since revised their fuel reserve policies, ensuring that final reserves are untouchable, except in emergencies. To further prevent the kinds of miscommunication which took place on this night, the US's Federal Aviation Administration and the International Civil Aviation Organization standardized English proficiency requirements across the world. Importantly, they also improved flow control measures to minimize delays. As a result of the crash of Flight 52, fuel exhaustion accidents have become rare, and aviation safety has significantly improved worldwide. However, there are other reasons that planes still do run out of fuel, including a more recent incident which I've covered here on the channel, where a fully loaded Airbus A330 ran out of fuel halfway across the Atlantic Ocean. Check out that video here.